The late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said, "You are entitled to your opinion, but not to your own facts." Yet Americans today often don't seem to agree on basic facts, or at least their interpretation of them. People who watch Fox or Newsmax or read Gateway Pundit and the like have a completely different view of the world than people who read newspapers or magazines. So Jenny, what is the role of conservative media in our politics and in shaping public perception of the state of the country?
Right. So I'm going to say 4 things. So first, fragmentation is not new. So the mass media era was a kind of unique moment in time where the ordinary public got a little bit of news at 7 p.m. when they watched one of the broadcast stations, and maybe they subscribed to their local papers. But it created this kind of even playing field, right, of the information environment. But before that, we had a much more fragmented information environment, and it was much more partisan. So we're functionally kind of back to how we had been before this unique moment. Second, journalists get their news from political elites. So the problem from my perspective is less that it's journalists and more that it is our current political moment where political elites, politicians, government officials have no qualms about saying things that are factually incorrect for ideological purposes. Third, tech platforms play a key role in this. They are part of the public sphere and they do not take that role seriously. As a result, they're actually throttling the quality of information that we're currently getting, and that's a huge problem. And then fourth, Nikki Usher wrote a brilliant book, News for the Rich, White, and Blue. And her argument is that journalists and the institution of journalism primarily is pushing news to the elite, rich, white members of the public. And she argues that it's actually time, I think, for journalists to take off the cloak of ideological neutrality and be more transparent with the public about who they serve and what their interests are.
Now, you mentioned that we're, in a way, we're going back to what had been, which is more fractured politically, various types of media. But now we can reach with tech, you know, any one person can reach basically everybody, and that seems like it must change the playing field too.
Well, but it's not. See, that's the thing. When we had, you know, the 3 networks, and Jenny, I think you nailed it in terms of, you know, that sort of hourglass, how we get information and how it narrowed when everyone was watching. You know, you had a choice of 3 networks and they were basically the same. We all had that shared experience, and now that we don't, and it's, while everyone can reach everyone, that's not what's happening. People are going to one little sector. You know, they'll go to one website, or they'll go listen to one, I hate the term, news influencer today. And so what's happening is we don't have that shared experience. And again, that's something that we had probably 100 years ago.
You know, but some shared experience, I think, does exist, because on the right, I mean, it does speak to, a lot of those sites seem to speak with this one voice.
Well, to Rick's point, it used to be an hourglass, and now it's a funnel. And it's funneled because we're preaching to the choir. We want to hear a particular slant on what happened. And mindset is not passive. It impacts how you interpret the world around you. So you have algorithms that are feeding you what you want to see. And on top of that, that impacts how you see things outside of there.
Mm-hmm. Chad?
I'm thinking about the facts issue that you raised in the beginning, and one of the readings that we all read before coming to this show was a New York Times guest piece by Julia Angwin, and she argued, quote, "Many voters headed to the polls convinced that border crossings are higher than ever before. They are not. Violent crimes are rising, untrue, and inflation is soaring, ditto." But she's being ignorant of a ton of detail there. Like, for example, just 2 weeks ago, the Times itself reported that immigration surge since 2021 was the largest in U.S. history, that not all violent crime is reported, and at 8%, annual inflation in 22 was higher than it had been over 40 years. And so I object to this assertion from the left that, that the right rejects facts, because there's a certain amount of sanctimony and hypocrisy in doing that. I'm not trying to draw an equivalency between the left and the right here or excuse the right's problem with facts, but rather if you're going to challenge the right and say that you're not doing something factual, your own facts better be bulletproof, and they're certainly not.
That didn't sound like those were not facts. And you just said, the right's problem with facts. So what is the right's problem with facts?
Oh, so like this article that I'm talking about, you know, they say that the right chooses their own facts or they ignore facts altogether. And so, for example, like many of the conservative voters in particular would believe things that inflation was soaring. While it is true that at election day, inflation was pretty tame, it's also true that prices were 22% higher at the end of the Biden administration than they were in the beginning. So if you're from the left and you want to attack the right as being ignorant or confused about the reality on the ground, you better recognize that nuance and say that like lived experience has shown us things like prices are way higher now. And
also said-
crime is, invisible crime, maybe not violent crime, is worse now than it was 5 years ago.
Okay, then how do you explain that conservative voters thought that the unemployment rate was at a 40-year high, when in fact it was, I mean, there's something where's that nuance? I understand people confusing prices right now with the impact of inflation over a longer period of time, the cumulative effect, but there are a number of things that I clearly think that the right has a bigger problem with accepting some
That's why I
facts.
said I don't want to draw an
Okay.
equivalency that the left and the right are the
But-
same in this. I'm saying save me the sanctimony, and if you're going to come to the table attacking the right on their mishandling of facts, your own facts better be bulletproof.
Well,
and,
how-
they're not.
And a great example of that is the origins of COVID, where it was a conspiracy theory in a lot of mainstream media outlets. Now there are some the evidence that supports that. So it's not just one side or the other, but that's the bigger problem, is that we're not just red or blue. We're the whole palette of art. And when we start trying to be two tribes, that's where the real issues start to come into play.
And on that point, like the origins of the coronavirus are exactly the kind of thing I'm thinking about. That when it was first suggested that it was a lab leak, the left-wing media kind of dismissed that as, no, that's racist, that's insensitive, that's, you know, unnecessarily baiting China. When, like, I'm sorry, that, you know, they were studying coronaviruses.
Well, is it the left-wing media that was doing that, or were there sources who were people in the
And that's the point, right, is exactly. It's not that it's the journalists who are making this stuff up. It's because you have elites, government officials, politicians who are making these stories and sharing them with journalists that are then getting reported.
And Vance-
so that's the problem.
And Vance admitted that they were going to make stuff up, and that he's fine with that in order to meet their ends.